Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome to tonight's Festival of Debate event. It's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Joe and I'm from the not-for-profit social enterprise Opus Independence that runs the Festival of Debate. If you've not come across the festival before, we run every year in Sheffield in spring and we feature over 60, 70 events, over 150 speakers, and the events are designed to increase discourse and dialogue around the key social, economic and political issues of the day. We're lucky in Sheffield to have a very verbose and forthright Director of Public Health, but tonight's event falls under the pre-election period, so he's somewhat stymied by some of the comments he can say this evening because of that. But thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm now going to hand over to Greg Fell, who's going to chair tonight's talk. Please give it up for Greg Fell.
I've been called many things. Verbose, that's the new one on me. Anyway, right. So thank you for turning out on a warm summer's night in Sheffield into the biggest lecture theatre in Sheffield, we think. We're fairly sure. You'll hear from Professor Sir Michael in a moment. I'll just literally two or three minutes. So, folk ask me frequently what matters most. Healthy life expectancy is the metric of health that matters most to me. One stat I'll use this evening, a baby born in Darnall can expect to get to about, a baby born tomorrow in Darnall can expect to get to about 45, 50 in a state of good health and live to 70, a third of their life in a state of poor health. A baby born in Dore tomorrow can expect to get to about 65, 70 in a state of good health and live to about 85, a seventh of a longer life in poorer health. One then asks, is that fair? Is that right? Is that just? And Professor Michael may comment on that. This stuff is new, but not new. We all want to solve this problem. It's called wicked for a reason. It's hard. We're 12 years since the Fairness Commission. We've been going at this for a long time since then, but this stuff is hard. Language and framing matters enormously. The factors that contribute to healthy life expectancy and the gap in that span civil society. So the health equity system equals civil society and all that sail in that ship. And we act with that in mind as we just about finish the next 10-year health and wellbeing strategy. The chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board is in the audience. You may or may not wish to make a presence known. So the framing of this matters. It's a social justice issue. It's clearly an NHS and social care demand issue. It's also a UK PLC economic productivity issue, and it's all of the above and then some. As I say, we're close to getting the content straight for the next version of the Sheffield Health and Wellbeing strategy. The Health and Wellbeing Board owns that. That's a partnership, and it's a proper partnership. The voluntary and community sector, the NHS and the local authority, and it will be heavily based on the principles that were set out by Michael a decade and a half ago, relatively recently updated. So where we go will be heavily based on that. I'll be interested to see how close a match. The provenance of tonight is that Joe's spoken a little bit about the Festival of Debate. It was either Joe or James said to me a while ago, well, we need someone who might be able to talk really expertly on health inequalities. I looked around, it wasn't me. We need an external expert to Sheffield. We had one name on the shortlist. It was Michael. We asked, and he agreed really quickly, and thank you for that. A date was set. We suddenly realised that tickets were selling really fast. We needed a bigger theatre. Remember Captain Quint from Jaws? We're going to need a bigger boat. Well, we needed a bigger theatre. You're in it, the biggest one in the city. Michael's COVID got in the way, so he's better now, just about. So we rescheduled, and then a general election was called. The rules for tonight. This stuff is political. It's impossible to not make it political. Health is political. My job is to avoid party politics, and a senior officer of a local authority in the middle of a general election campaign, I will be very dull this evening. Some may say he's always dull. Someone says he's verbose and dull. Michael may say whatever he wants. That's his call. Michael's going to talk for about 40 minutes, then do Q&A. And we will have roving mics in the room. They're here. Hopefully someone will be in charge of the roving mic, so I'm not panting up and down the steps. I've got my Strava app on, so I may get some steps in. So we'll be done by 7:15 latest. There are some copies of one of Michael's recent books outside, so if you want to go and buy a copy, please do. I've got my own copy. It's fabulous. Thoroughly recommend that you have it. Mine's very well thumbed. We'll do Q&A after Michael's finished. Go anywhere you want, Q&A wise. I'll get to as many as I possibly can. I know I won't get to all of them, but I'll get to as many as I can. I'm not answering for obvious reasons, but Michael will say whatever Michael says. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Sir Michael Marmot.
A great pleasure to be here with this audience. I only had to remember to do one thing. It's still a great pleasure to be here with this audience this evening. I maintain the fiction that I am not party political. I speak from the evidence. If some of what I show you looks to be critical of the existing government, it doesn't come from my priors, it comes from the evidence. The opening line of my book, The Health Gap, was why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick. We hear a great deal, rightly so, about the NHS and the trouble it's in, particularly with the pandemic and the aftermath, and it's vitally important. What I'm going to talk about is the conditions that make people sick, not just the healthcare system. I chaired the WHO, the World Health Organization Commission on Social Determinants of Health. And in the wake of that global commission, I was asked by the British government how we could apply the findings and recommendations of the Global Commission to one country, England. And I produced the Marmot Review, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, and we had initially 6 domains of recommendations. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4, really radical for a rich country. Everybody should have enough money to live. Number 5, healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work, including, as we discussed this afternoon, housing. And number 6, taking a social determinants approach to prevention. We've added 2, tackle discrimination, racism, and their outcomes. And in fact, the 8th one was there all along. Pursue environmental sustainability and health equity together. In 2020, in February 2020, on the 10-year anniversary of the publication of the Marmot Review, we produced Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on. What had happened in the previous decade? This is what had happened, and I've updated it slightly. Life expectancy, if we go back to 1989, in fact, we could go back to 1900, life expectancy had been improving about 1 year every 4 years. 1 year every 4 years. 6 hours every 24 hours. Means you got the first 6 hours today for nothing. That's amazing. And that had been going on for the whole century until in 2010, the rate of improvement slowed dramatically. And then in 2020, and in fact, later data even more, life expectancy fell. What that means is from 2010 to 2022, life expectancy did not improve. 13 years. I can't think of another period in the UK in peacetime, or maybe even in war, where we had a 13-year period where life expectancy didn't improve. I said I'm not party political, but if the Prime Minister says the plan is working, was this the plan? Not to have health improve? When we published that report 10 years on, people said, maybe we've reached peak life expectancy. It's got to slow down sometime. So we looked at other countries. We had the slowest improvement of any rich country, except Iceland and the United States. We had not reached peak life expectancy. Something was going wrong in Britain. I show this as one example. I could have South Yorkshire and it would look similar. Compare London and the Northeast. What we see all around the country is the greater the deprivation, the shorter the life expectancy. And here's London. You see, the greater the deprivation, the shorter the life expectancy. And similarly in the Northeast. If you're in the least deprived, 10%, there's very little difference. If you're rich, it doesn't much matter where in the country you live. The poorer you are, the bigger the disadvantage of living in the North. Or to put it another way, the consequences for your health of a given level of deprivation are bigger in the Northeast, the Northwest, the East Midlands, the West Midlands, everywhere outside London. Now look at what happened over time. In London, so this is the dotted line is 2010-12. In London, life expectancy improved along the gradient. There's still a gradient, but it improved right along the gradient. In the Northeast, life expectancy fell in the poorest 10%. It didn't improve in the second decile, the third decile, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. It didn't improve for the bottom 60% and got worse for the poorest. So this is where we were pre-pandemic. Life expectancies more or less stopped improving. The inequalities by deprivation and region were increasing. And life expectancy for the poorest people was getting worse. Now, all the evidence on social determinants of health tells us that the health of the population is a reflection of how well that society is meeting people's needs. If health has stopped improving, it means society has stopped improving. If health inequalities are getting bigger, it means inequalities in society are getting bigger. If health for the poorest people is getting worse, it means conditions for the poorest people are getting worse. I told you I'm not party political. I look at the evidence. Something's gone really, 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 really wrong. And it didn't have to be that way. The implied promise is that health will improve all the time. The baby boomer generation, I think that's me. Our parents believed, rightly so, that everything would be better for our generation. And we believe that for our children. Our children can no longer believe that for their children. That's not right. Shouldn't be that way. And it's got to change. And do we understand what went wrong? Yeah, I think we do a bit. That was the first challenge. You'll remember the government elected in 2010 had one principle: roll back the state, austerity, reduce public sector expenditure. And by golly, they did it. They were true to their word. In 2009-10, public sector expenditure was 42% of gross domestic product. That went down year on year. By 2019-20, that 42% had become 35%. Just think about that for a moment. 7% of GDP, annual reduction. Today's GDP, at today's figures, is something like 2.6, 2.7 trillion pounds. 7% of 2.7 trillion is 188 billion. Annual public sector expenditure at today's prices went down by 188 billion pounds. Wow. You could recruit a few school teachers. You could stop the roof falling in on a few schools for that. You could pay people in social care a living wage, couldn't you, with 188 billion pounds a year? That's what they took out at today's prices of public sector expenditure. That might have just done a little bit of damage. If some of that public sector expenditure was doing good things, if you take it away, maybe some of those good things won't happen anymore. And then the pandemic. Remember, the Chancellor said, whatever it takes. Here's a trick question. Can you remember who the Chancellor was? Since the Brexit referendum, we've had 7 chancellors. I was sitting with Winnie Byanyima, the executive director of UNAIDS in Brazil, as one does, and we were talking about governance. And she said, well, the UK is a well-governed country. I said, we've had 7 ministers of finance in 7 years between 2016 and 2023. 5 prime ministers, 7 secretaries of state for health, 10 housing ministers. I've lost track of how many education secretaries we've had. A well-governed country? This is utter chaos. Anyway, I'm diverting. I'm diverting. The Chancellor is now the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor. He said, whatever it takes. And I thought, hang on a minute. We were faced with a financial crisis in 2008-9, and the Chancellor didn't say, whatever it takes. He said, we've got to cut public spending or we'll be like Greece. Actually, Greece is doing quite well, but that's another question. He didn't say whatever it takes. You mean this wasn't a moral necessity? It wasn't an economic necessity. It was a political decision. The damage that was done to the country may have been as a consequence of a political decision. I told you I maintain the fiction that I'm not party political. And if we look at what happened to child poverty, the previous government had a policy of reducing child poverty, and they were doing pretty well. Child poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. Global financial crisis, child poverty went up, but then it resumed its downward course. So in 2010, after housing costs, 27% of children were in poverty. That 27% became 30% in 2019. Actually, it's 31% there. It went down with the Chancellor's generosity in the first year of the pandemic, and now it's on its rise up again. The government likes to say, oh, don't measure relative poverty, measure absolute poverty. I'll come to that. And it's not just poverty, but deep poverty. So here's the percent of people in poverty, less than 60% median income. And this is the percent of people less than 50%. and the percent of people less than 40% after housing costs. And you can see that the proportion in deep poverty has gone up. You could say, well, less than 60% is a bit of hardship. Less than 40% of median income is real hardship. And the proportion of people in poverty who are in deep poverty has gone up. Well, isn't it a problem everywhere? Yeah. I mean, there's the UK child poverty rates, the US. I really like the US. It looks worse than we do on just about every statistic. So whenever I think things are bad here, I live. You think we got a problem with our democracy? Look at the US. Child poverty? Look at the US. Life expectancy? Look at the US. Handling COVID? Look at the US. They do worse than we do on just about everything. But we do worse than just about everybody else. If you look at the change in child income poverty rates, we had the biggest increase of 39 countries, actually even worse than the United States. No wonder the government doesn't like to quote relative poverty, because we had the biggest increase of 39 countries. I was listening to this on a podcast out on my morning walk. I got a blister. I thought I'd worn these shoes for a year. Why did I get a blister? I was so angry. So George Osborne said, the policies we pursued after 2010 meant we had the strongest growth in the G7. More jobs were created. A lot of Britain in 2016 was buzzing. People looking at the UK and saying, that's the example we want to follow. And I thought, where was I in 2016? I don't recognize that. This is the change in real wages since 2009. And these are comparison countries. Change in real wages. In 2016, we were the example the other countries wanted to follow. They wanted to have their workers get poorer. And we were ahead of the pack. How can you say such barefaced nonsense? And if you look, it went up under the Conservatives a bit, went up more under Labour, went down under the Conservatives. They're the peer countries. Incomes of employed people are lower than they were in 2007. Would you boast about economic performance with figures like that? Government spending, percent of GDP, it was coming down at the end of the Thatcher Major period, going up under Labour, coming down under the Conservatives. That's the average of peer countries. You can misbelieve these figures. They come from a left-wing journal, the Financial Times. Government spending on healthcare, percent of GDP, went up and went down. NHS waiting lists. You've heard apologists say, oh, it was COVID, it was the war in Ukraine, it was the cost of living crisis, it was the doctors' strike. It would have been brilliant if the doctors hadn't been so greedy. If we take January 2009 as 100, the number of people waiting for treatment. In 1997, it was 230. So at the end of the Conservative government, New Labour said they would bring it down. And I tell you, I'm not a supporter of New Labour. I'm just looking at the figures. So it came down from 230 to 100 by January 2009. By 2019, it was 190. It had nearly doubled before COVID, before the war in Ukraine, before the energy crisis, before the cost of living crisis, before the nurses went on strike. It had doubled. Now it's tripled. So yeah, those other things mattered too. We did something, we published this earlier this year. I'd wanted to do for a long time. People like me, like Greg Fell, talk about life expectancy for the poorest. And it's terrible, the poor life expectancy for the poorest. I said, let's look at the richest. Not, I hasten to add, because I worry about them, getting water ski injuries in the Bahamas. But the least deprived, tell us what's possible. What if everybody had the low mortality of the least deprived 10%? It's a gradient. So we've calculated excess deaths. The assumption is that everybody, if we could improve social circumstances, would have the low mortality of the least deprived 10%. Anything above that, we call that excess. And you can see the greater the deprivation, the greater the level of excess deaths. So over the decade, if we take the 2009-10 average, over that decade, we calculated the excess deaths, and there were 1 million excess deaths linked to deprivation in the decade from 2010 to 2020. Now, there would have been excess deaths linked to deprivation in the previous decade, because there's a gradient, but the gradient got steeper. And we calculated that there were 148,000 more excess deaths linked to deprivation in the decade from 2010 on. That's a prima facie case that austerity led to 148,000 excess deaths. And in the first year of the pandemic, a further 28,000. The plan is working. And Greg mentioned healthy life expectancy by region. There's the southeast, and you can see this huge gradient for women and for men. In my 2010 review, I was trying to combine two ideas. The classic Anglo-Saxon approach to social policy is you target the worst off, means-tested benefits. A more Nordic approach is you have universalist policies. So I said, how about we combine them? We have universalist policies with effort proportionate to need, proportionate universalism. You can see why I'm not a politician. Could you imagine going to the barricades with banners? What do we want? Proportionate universalism. When do we want it? In the fullness of time. So you could call it leveling up. That's a good idea. If you focus only on the poorest, you miss the health disadvantage of those above that threshold because of the gradient. So we want universalist policies with effort proportionate to need. What did we get post-2010? We plotted life expectancy of local areas in 2010 to 12, and then we looked at the subsequent change in local government funding. Look at this. The shorter the life expectancy of a local area in 2010-12, the steeper the reduction in government funding. In what moral universe could that be the right thing to do? Is it possible that the government looked and said, the sicker the area, the more money we'll take away from them? Is that possible that they could have done that? Or was this absent-mindedness? They somehow took the money away for some other reason. Does that make it any better to do such a thing? They've destroyed local government and destroyed it more in the more deprived, sicker areas where they need it most. This is effort inversely proportionate to need. The greater the need, the greater the reduction in spending. Could this have played a role in the slowdown in health improvement, the increased inequalities, the decline in life expectancy in the poorest areas? Yeah, I think it could. I'm back in the Financial Times. Look at this, the distribution of income, adjusting for purchasing power. This is the top 10%, the 90th centile of income earners. There's Norway, and the red line is the UK. People at the 90th centile, 10 percentage points from the top, in the UK are as rich as Norway. They're poorer than Switzerland and the United States. Now, the 50th centile, the median, in the UK, we're a good deal poorer than Norway. In the 10th centile, we're way below Norway, who's up there with Switzerland. We're below Slovenia. The UK is a poor country with some rich people. Norway is a rich country. They have a distribution. Not everybody has the same income. They have inequalities. But Norway's a rich country, and we're a poor country with some rich people. As shown by this. If you take the UK gross domestic product and remove the richest region, London, GDP goes down by 14%. If you go to Germany and remove the richest region, Munich, GDP doesn't change, essentially. If you go to the Netherlands and remove the richest region, Amsterdam, GDP goes down by about 4%. The US, take away Seattle, and it goes down 2%. If you remove London from the UK, we are as poor as Mississippi, the poorest US state. The UK is Mississippi plus London. And Mississippi is a very poor place to live, with very poor health and social services. That's where we are in the UK. We're Mississippi plus London. And I don't think that's right. The future of the country depends on changing that. And I live in London, but the future depends on changing that. This comes from the Resolution Foundation, Life in the Slow Lane. One of the problems with citing GDP growth is that the population's growing. So, of course, the gross domestic product's growing. So if we look at GDP growth per person, and as the Resolution Foundation says, if we have the starting point with the global financial crisis, then the US grew 1.2%, annual growth, Germany 0.9, Japan 0.6, France 0.5. We, along with Canada, had the second lowest of the G7. Not so good, actually. You know, the government keeps saying, well, we've had all these crises. Yeah, it's true that none of those had Brexit except us. But we're not doing very well. The crises seem to have affected the UK more than the rest of the G7 except Italy. And if you look at GDP per person ranking among OECD countries, Great Britain, we've been slipping down the rankings. We're getting poorer. We're not doing very well. And then came COVID. It was predictable that the pandemic, far from being the great equalizer, would expose the underlying inequalities in society and amplify them. And so it proved. The green bars, the pale green, is all-cause mortality, and the blue is COVID-19. And you can see the gradient, the greater the deprivation, the greater the all-cause mortality, and the slope for COVID looks very similar to the slope for all-cause mortality. Slightly steeper for COVID, because in the bottom 3 deciles, people employed in frontline occupations, living in overcrowded households. So yes, we needed vaccination. Yes, we needed social distancing and lockdown and so on. But we need to address the inequalities because they showed up with COVID. And if we look at life expectancy, for the 3 years 2018 to 20, which includes the first year of the pandemic, compared with the previous triennium, life expectancy fell for the bottom 4 deciles. For males, and the greater the deprivation, the greater the fall, and females. In fact, it didn't improve for males at all. It improved for females in the top 6 deciles. But for the bottom 4 deciles, life expectancy fell. And healthy life expectancy, women in the poorest decile can expect to live a third of their life with ill health. Austerity, the pandemic, and then the cost of living crisis, all having adverse impact on health and health equity. I said the government likes to say absolute poverty has gone down. Well, I'd be a bit careful about that. This is destitution from Joseph Rowntree Foundation. They define destitution as doing without 2 or more of housing, heat, light, food, clothing, and toiletries, toothpaste, soap. In 2022, 1 million children were living in a state of destitution. The report that was published today from the Food Foundation said that height of 5-year-old children has been going down. Height's been going down. Our kids are getting shorter because we're not feeding them. And we're not feeding them because we're too poor. I'd be very careful boasting about how many children we've taken out of absolute poverty when this is what the figures actually show. A 2.5-fold increase in destitution in children. And work is supposed to be the way out of poverty. This is the percent of working age adults in poverty who are in households where at least one adult is working. So this is the UK. 2/3 of people in poverty are in households where at least one adult is working. Work is supposed to be the way out of poverty, but it's not if you're lowly paid. And if you're on universal credit, the Trussell Trust and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation calculated the cost of basic essentials, which are a bit like the 6 that I've just mentioned, the JRF did. If you're on universal credit, it meets about 70% of the cost of essentials. So if you're on universal credit, we guarantee you'll get sick because we don't give you enough money to meet the basic essentials. Then we wonder why our children aren't growing. We've produced several reports now on cold homes. Cold homes damage children's lungs. Cold homes damage children's mental health. Children growing up in cold homes do less well in school. When I produced my first report on this, former chair of council of the British Medical Association said to me, I can't do his Edinburgh accent, but he said, when I was a lad, you know, we had ice in the inside of the windows. You can't tell me cold homes damaged my... I said, Hamish, imagine what you might have achieved if you'd grown up in a warm home. Fuel poverty. 3 causes of fuel poverty. The cost of energy, and the energy efficiency of a home. This is excess winter deaths. Cost of fuel and poverty. This is the percent of household budget spent on energy. If you're in the top 10% of household income in France, you spend about 6% of your income on energy at home. If you're in the top 10% in the UK, you spend about 6% of your household budget on energy. If you're in the poorest 10% in France, you spend about 10% of your household budget on energy. If you're in the poorest 10% in the UK, you spend nearly 18% on energy. That gap between the richest and the poorest in the percent of household budget spent on energy is bigger in the UK than in any other European country. The UK is not a good place to be poor. What about spending money? I told you I'd never make a politician. We are a low-tax country. You hear the government boasting that they're lowering taxes. They're not, they're raising them. And you hear Labour saying we've got the highest tax rates for 70 years. The fact is, tax rates in the UK are at around 34% of GDP. In the EU14, they're at around 40%. We're a low-tax country. It may be the highest rate for 70 years, but it's still a good deal lower than other European countries. I told you I'd never make a politician. I think we ought to spend a bit more money to improve our schools and our healthcare system and pay... This is pretty grim, isn't it? This is pretty damn awful. The second most common question I get asked is, why aren't you depressed? You have to pay money to find out what the most common question is, but that's... Why aren't I depressed? More than 40 places have declared themselves Marmot places. Coventry was the first, a Marmot city. Andy Burnham said, come on, we'll do it in Greater Manchester. So we did a report, Build Back Fairer in Greater Manchester. Cheshire and Merseyside, Lancashire and Cumbria, Luton, a Marmot town, Waltham Forest, a Marmot borough, Gwent, and Southwest, Leeds. By the end of the year, places are approaching us faster than we can react. Legal & General, a big financial organization, approached us and said, we want to know if what we do in our day job could improve health and health inequalities. And we want to know not just for Legal & General, but could business play a role? And we said, well, yeah, we did a report, 3 domains, good quality work, pay everybody a real living wage, good conditions for workers. That's got to be good for business as well as good for health. Second, healthy products and services. If you're the tobacco industry, we cannot work with you. If you're the food industry, are you going to be good for health or bad for health? Because you could do it either way. So healthy products and services, and then the wider impact on the community, purchasing decisions, environment and the like. We're working with the East London Foundation Trust, and a public health doctor said the Marmot Mountain. He took our 3 domains of recommendations for business, proportionate universalism, said we could do that. The East London Foundation Trust as a training and employment provider, thinking about our service users, and the impact on the wider Luton community. Well, I will show you that. When Keir Starmer produced his health mission last year, they produced a technical appendix, which I read, and maybe 1 or 2 others read, but I'm not sure who else, and said, the next Labour government will amplify the approach of Marmot cities like Greater Manchester and Coventry by making England a Marmot country, tackling the social inequalities that influence health. I missed that in the manifesto. I've given ample grounds for being miserable, being in a state of despair, but I don't feel it. I look at what's happening at local level, and I finish by quoting Raymond Williams. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That was 1 amazing, 2 depressing, 3 you cheered us up right at the very, very end. So we've got ample time for Q&A. I'm hoping our roving mic operators, I think that's a proper job title, do have their mics. We're going to rove around the room as best we can. I'll clock you first. Stick your hand up in time on the tradition. We'll make our people do their steps. I will remind you of the rules. I will not be answering questions. I'm a senior officer in democracy. It's a general election period, but Michael can say whatever he wants. This lady first, and then there was a gentleman up there, and then you third.
Caroline Mitchell, GP and a clinical academic. I've been working for 34 years. My patch is South East Sheffield. Orgreave sits in our patch. And over time, I've observed, that we've stalled, made virtually no difference in life expectancy. I think we're a good general practice, but I've seen flatline funding for primary care and it being slowly dismantled away from Starfield's 4Cs principles. We know social determinants really do determine health. What contribution can primary care have to addressing the needs at a local and a population level? We've been trying our hardest.
Yeah, my thought about it is you can't do it alone. When I spent a year as president of the World Medical Association, I was trying to get the doctors engaged in social determinants of health. And we produced a report thinking about medicine in general. And we said 5 things: education and training, so understanding the problem. Second, as a good primary care doctor, you would do anyway, seeing the patient in broader perspective. But it relates, I'll come back to it in a moment. The third, the health service as employer, And I would now say, as anchor institution, we just showed you having an impact on the community and the like. But the fourth, related to seeing the patient in broader perspective, is working in partnership. I'm going to talk at the social prescribing conference tomorrow. And that's primary care working in partnership. It's not changing the structure of society, but it is saying we need to work with others in partnership to try and get people improving their lives, whether it's exercising language skills, supporting older people and the like. So there's a great deal that can be done. I see it as first steps rather than the total solution. I've told you I'd like to have a fairer society that wasn't a poor country, it wasn't Mississippi plus London. You can't do that in primary care. But you can do social prescribing. And the fifth recommendation was advocacy. Doctors are listened to. We tell the truth. We're trusted. We're listened to. Talk to these people. You can't talk to them while the election's on, but talk to these people at city government. Point out what needs to be done to improve things because it's not working. So I think you can't do it alone, but there's a great deal you can do.
So, gentleman halfway up. Yeah.
Hello, yeah, I'm Carl. I run opticians in the city, and I've done some work in the past on the inequality in child pedestrian casualties when I worked in a different job. My question is that when we have a new Prime Minister soon, if they ring you up and say, will you come and sit on the cabinet and become Minister for Health Inequalities, would you take that role?
I probably got a very important disqualification for that role because I'm addicted to telling the truth. And that does seem to be a disqualification for the job. And because I think I kind of know what's got to happen. And if I'm sitting around the cabinet table and they say, no, we promise not to spend any money, it can't happen. That's one problem. The second is that I wouldn't want a particular portfolio because this has got to be cross-government action. We've got to improve early child development and education and employment and working conditions and economic circumstances. So firstly, I very much doubt they'd ring me up and ask me for the reason I just said. But secondly, we've got to get a mechanism for cross-government action. And I think that's vitally important.
There's a gentleman right at the front.
Hello, I'm Michael. I work as an analyst for the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. It seems like quite a popular way to get buy-in for like policies which put health or social determinants first is to focus on productivity, kind of the economic aspect, less ill health, or kind of wider health economic argument. I kind of wondered how you felt about that, as opposed to focusing on health as a common good in general, and what other ways to kind of encourage buy-in for those kind of policies that you kind of can think of?
Yeah, so I've been involved in an argument for some decades with economists. And finally, I think I've got a resolution to it. The argument with economists is we've got to improve health in order to get economic growth. And my argument is we've got to improve the economy to get better health. And I say, I didn't become a doctor because I thought if we relieve people of their illness, they get richer. That was not my motivation. And I didn't go into public health because I thought if we improve population health, the economy would grow. That was not my motivation. But the economists all say, oh, no, you wouldn't want to improve health unless it led to economic growth. What? Surely health is a higher good than the numbers of GDP per capita. That's a value. That's my value judgment. And I mentioned that I was in Brazil because I was talking to the health committee, the health working group of the G20. We're trying to get social determinants of health on the G20 agenda. And I think we might have made progress, so that's good. And it was a health and economics working group. And so I said, okay, I'll give it to you. If you improve health, you will improve the economy. The cost of the economy from obesity and diabetes and is enormous. I'll give you that. But then how are you going to improve health? Not just via the healthcare system. You've got to invest in the social determinants of health. So even if I give you your argument that we've got to improve health in order to prove. Now, I don't cite the economic arguments, but if I dropped a lifelong commitment never to cite a Chicago economist and cited a Chicago economist, the evidence is $1 invested in early child development reaps $7 in benefit later. So the argument is it's a rare case, investing in early childhood, where the equity and efficiency arguments come together. You do it because it's the right thing to do. It's a matter of social justice. And you reap an economic reward. And that means we should have a fundamental shift. And that, if I were silly enough to accept the role, I'd say we've got to distinguish between when things are costs and when they're investments. Investment in early childhood, we shouldn't think of that as a cost, it's an investment. The problem is it reaps the reward after the next election. So if you're the Chancellor and you've got to stand up in the House of Commons and justify what you're doing, the OBR said you've just added to the deficit. Yeah, but in the future we'll get benefit. We'll have reduced crime from investing in early childhood. We'll have better health from investing in early childhood. We'll have probably better productivity because we'll have a better educated workforce. But all that will come in the future. So I don't know that I'm well fitted for the role you want to give me.
This will test my eyesight, maybe not my hearing. The gentleman right at the very back, and then Charles, I think. Yep.
Thank you. Michael, thank you very much for a really stimulating but thoroughly depressing presentation. My question, by the way, I don't work for anybody. I'm a independent, free-thinking person. My question relates, well, a statement first of all. I perceive that we live in an over-centralised political system. If you agree with that premise, I'm just interested in your thoughts on the extent to which increased devolution of power and authority to local areas, and also the ability for local areas to raise taxes for themselves, regardless of what the government thinks. To what extent would those things be a solution to the problem that you've been talking about this evening?
So just your first comment, when I get home this evening, my wife says, how was your trip to Sheffield? I can say it was terrific. I made everybody depressed. I hope you got the glimmer of hope at the end. We've been working with local areas for a negative reason and a positive reason. The negative reason is because central government hasn't been doing the right thing. The positive reason is what happens at local area is much closer to the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, the social determinants of health. Local government, in general, understands that much better than central government. And as I said in passing, local government's been destroyed. The central government's support to local government over the decade from 2010 went down by 59%. It went down dramatically in the first 5 years of the coalition government, and the actual local government spending power went down less after that because local government was allowed to raise revenue. So overall it went down by 34, 35%. So whatever argument we want to have about how much devolution, this cutting local government off at the knees, destroying it, has to have been the wrong thing to do. Absolutely the wrong thing to do. Local governments looks after education and social care and housing. I mean, all those important things, quite apart from leisure centres and libraries and parks and so on. And the money's been taken away. So going not back, forward to a situation where local government has more power has to be the right thing to do. It can't be right to have taken all that money away. So quite apart from some theoretical or ideological discussion about the right amount of devolution, the amount of centralization that we've had over the last decade is wrong. That's been very harmful. So we need local government to be empowered again to do some of the important things that don't seem to be happening nationally. And so, you know, I've been asked more than once to join this sort of movement for devolution. And I'm not ideological about it. I just think that local government has a lot of important things to do and it needs to be better funded, whether that's through local revenue raising powers or central government support. Yeah. People have died of boredom discussing financing of local government, and I don't want to perpetrate that on you. But certainly we need to empower local government to a much greater degree than we've done at the moment.
So Charles, and then there's a lady right at the very front, and then I'll try and come to you. Yeah, I'm getting as many as I can. I'm going to make Sam do his steps though. Charles.
Charles, I'm a recently retired GP, and like Caroline, have watched the consequences of austerity very starkly and surprisingly quickly over the last 14 years. So you are in a privileged position. You've created the most astonishing and stark evidence for us, and you've been doing this for many years. You must get a chance to talk to the people in power. How do they explain what they're doing?
Well, forgive me if I do this. I know you want to get to a number of questions, but I'll tell you a story. It must have been 2 summers ago. Yeah, it must have been 2 summers ago. I was invited to some summer party, and Sajid Javid was Secretary of State for Health. And somebody at this summer gathering said, "How do you get on with Sajid Javid?" And I said, "I've never met him." And the person I was talking to said, "You're the leading authority on health inequalities, public health leader, and you've never met the Secretary of State?" Never met him. The next day, that was Sunday. Monday, I get an email from Sajid Javid's office saying the Secretary of State would like to talk to you. I thought, who was I talking to yesterday? Who is well connected? So that was Monday. On Tuesday, Sajid Javid resigned. People think that it had something to do with Boris Johnson. The real reason was the word had got out that he was going to meet me and embarrass those people. So, and in fact, I was sitting with a former health minister, a Conservative, and we had coffee together. He said, "You know, the present government doesn't like you." And I said, "Well, I kind of knew that, but to hear it put quite so baldly is, from inside, is really something." So no, the present government doesn't listen to me. They don't want to hear me. And somebody I was asking me the other day, was interviewing me about something or other, and she said, how do they deal with your evidence? I said, well, you know, people are writing PhD theses as we speak about confirmation bias. If the evidence doesn't fit with your prior view, you rule it out. You don't deal with it. You rule it out. So that's how they deal with it. It doesn't fit. There must be something wrong with it. We rule it out. We just don't want to know. So I've not, forgive me for this little bit of indulgence now, but when I was sitting, I'm embarrassed about this, but anyway, I'll go on. When I was sitting with this former minister, and he said, you know, the present government doesn't like you. I said, 3 months ago, I was made a companion of honor. How come? Were they just too incompetent to block it? I mean, what happened? And then I said, no, that's unkind. The fact is that I can be sharply critical of what the government's been doing based on the evidence and be given this high award. It says something good about our country. There are a lot of good places where I'd be locked up. I'd be silenced. I'd lose my job. I couldn't. So I can talk freely. I mean, you can't because it's an election, but
I'm verbose, apparently. Take that one to heart.
You know, it says something good about this country, that I can tell the truth, I can look at the evidence, I can talk about it. The current government has not wanted to listen to me.
I think there's a mic right at the very back, and then there's 2 questions at the front. So I'm gonna get Sam to get his steps in. So right at the very back.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'll definitely be buying your book afterwards as a result. You touched on food briefly. Food and the impact of the food industry. I was wondering if you could expand on that slightly, and in particular how the impact of food over the last decade and more has had an impact that's been unequal. Thank you.
Well, so what we know, that the latest figures from the Food Foundation is that in January this year, 20% of families with children suffered food insecurity, which means that they went a whole day without eating because of inability to afford food. They skipped a meal, or they didn't eat enough to satisfy hunger because of lack of money. 1/5 of families with children suffered food insecurity. When people can get enough money to buy something, and you know the cost of living crisis, when inflation was around 10%, it was something like 9% for the top 20% of incomes, and it was 17% for the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, because prices went up for food and energy, and that makes up a higher proportion of the expenditure of low-income households. When you've heard politicians say, oh, I could live on 30p a day, you know, poor people are feckless, they're ignorant, they're lazy, they don't know how to cook, and on and on and on. The calculation is that if you're in the bottom 20% of household income, to follow the healthy eating advice, you'd have to spend 50% of your income on food. These people are not feckless, they're not lazy, they're not ignorant, they're poor. Don't blame poor people, blame their poverty. So food is important, vitally important, but the calculations are it's cheaper to feed your family junk food that's calorie dense, high in fat, sugar, salt, than it is to feed healthy food. It costs less. And that's why at the same time, we can have 5-year-old children not growing to the same extent that they should, and obesity at the same time. Because people who don't understand say, how could you say that people are food insecure if their kids are fat? Well, because it's the quality of food that they're being fed. So food is vitally important. And when I was approached just a few weeks ago, there'd been both The Guardian and The Express, so, a right-wing and what passes for a left-wing newspaper, had both done it. And that hospitalizations for rickets and scurvy had gone up. Oh my God, we're back in Victorian times. We can't feed our children properly anymore. So food is vitally important. You know that in an earlier life when I was much more involved in cardiovascular disease, we talked about diet and heart disease and the like. Now I'm concerned about Victorian diseases of malnutrition.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Rachel. My question is about a relatively small group of people who don't necessarily fit into a lot of the slides that you've mentioned because they aren't necessarily living within deprivation or poverty. And that's a group of children who are adopted, but they have huge, huge health inequalities. They're overrepresented in so many of the negative, poorer, less desirable aspects of life, like homelessness, prison population, mental health services, neurodiversity services. Because they're not seen, because they are living with probably relatively affluent people, then they're just hidden, aren't they? And so what can and what should we do to address those health inequalities before they then start appearing in the statistics?
It's a very important point, very important point. And I'm not saying adopted kids are the same as the other groups I'm about to mention, but you could say the same with disability, forgotten. And people like me who are very concerned about socioeconomic inequalities, what about these special groups? People with disability, sexual orientation, gender identification, adopted children. We're now doing a big study, a big report on structural racism because people of different ethnic groups say, you've forgotten us in your concern with socioeconomic differences. So it's vitally important that these other groups do not get forgotten. It's part of having an inclusive society. It's part of universal social programs of including everybody.
So one question there, and then there's two more, and we might be getting towards the end. So I may need to cut you off. Go on.
Hi, I'm Amy. When the election was called, I was the next day with a group of people who all face a 15 to 25 year sort of life expectancy gap through severe mental illness. And I was sort of feeling hopeful because something might change. And every single one of them told me they don't vote because they're all the same. And a lot of the people we talk about living in poverty, they quite often aren't in rooms like this, seeing the graphs and seeing that that's not the case. And I didn't know what to say to them. What would you say to them?
People with mental illness.
People who are massively affected by political decisions, but then are too disenfranchised to vote.
I mean, the first thing to say, a bit like my response to the previous question, is all the social determinants of health that I talk about affect people with mental illness more, both as a cause of mental illness, but also the society's response to people with mental illness. So more difficulty getting jobs, more difficulty with all the social determinants of health. And the same with people with disability and the like, neurodiverse, etc. The other part is that we know that half the lifetime onset of mental illness begins by age 14. And the evidence suggests there's a great deal that we can do to prevent mental illness before age 14. The social determinants of health, adverse childhood experiences, lack of the, so that's the negative side, lack of the positive of nurturing family support and the like. And both of those, the negative, adverse childhood experiences, and the lack of the positive of nurturing, supportive, etc., both of them follow the social gradient. The greater the deprivation, the greater the likelihood of adverse childhood experiences and a lack of nurturing. So I would argue that the kind of recommendations that I'm making, if applied well, would both reduce the likelihood of onset of mental illness and improve conditions for people with existing mental illness to get more integrated into society. So don't feel disenfranchised. Vote, make your voice heard. Get out there and say, we count too. Make your voice heard.
Two last questions. I think I may need to cut you off of there, so we're already over. So these two here.
Is your presentation available anywhere? Because I've got friends and family that work in health and related professions that are putting small children to bed at this sort of time. But I'd really love to be able to go through your presentation with them because the context that it provides is so important.
Well, what I can say is if you look at the Institute of Health Equity website, all our reports are on the Institute of Health Equity website, and my presentation comes from our various reports.
I'll take chair's prerogative. Michael's book is available upstairs, and this lecture will be on YouTube at some point in the not too distant future. I don't know where and how, and that's Joe's job, not my job, but we'll definitely be on YouTube. Last question, I think.
Hello, thank you. I'm Beth Crackles, Chief Executive at Sheffield Hospitals Charity. We support Sheffield Teaching Hospitals and Sheffield Health and Social Care NHS Trusts. We are considering what our funding looks like across health inequalities at the moment, recognising that it is massive and we could support across from acute right through to the community, recognising the social determinants have a huge influence, recognising that we need a multi-sector approach. I'm really interested in what you feel is or could be the role of philanthropy in tackling health inequalities.
The role of?
Philanthropy. Thank you.
Well, I reviewed a book for The Lancet that talked about, what are they called, effective altruism. And I thought it's hard to be against anything that's effective and altruistic, so that all sounds good. When you get underneath the hood, it doesn't look quite as good as it sounds. There's a lot of self-interest under this altruism. So, I mean, the voluntary and community sector is very important, and we've always said that. To the extent that the voluntary and community sector is funded from philanthropy, then I guess philanthropy is not a bad thing. So I'm not against people being philanthropic, but that doesn't let national or local government off the hook. You know, could you imagine if you could only have an MRI if some rich donor had given an MRI to the hospital? What? What if a rich donor didn't give an MRI to your hospital, but only to that hospital? Really? Is that how we want to run things? You know, what would happen if a child who was neurodiverse could only be treated appropriately if some philanthropist had given something to that local authority, but not to some other local authority? So I'm not against philanthropy, you know, it taps into people's best interests. But as I said, it doesn't let the system off the hook.
So, right, you've had your hand. Last question, because I'm a well-known rule breaker and we're already over. So last
Thank
question,
you.
then we will call it.
My question, very simply, is there anything that you would take out of adversarial politics to solve some of the issues? I mean,
Is there anything that I would
take out of adversarial politics? So the fact that basically, well, you know what adversarial politics is.
Well, anything I take out of adversarial politics. I mean, for the first few weeks of this election, I didn't hear anybody talk about child poverty. I must have missed it. Did you hear? You know, that I couldn't bring myself to watch the debates. Life's too short. But I'm not sure anybody mentioned child poverty in the debates. You know, I'd like some discussion of the real. I think we're in real trouble. And it starts preconception, childbirth, early childhood, through the life course. And that's what I'd like us to be talking about. And, you know, I'm mostly naive, but I'm enough of a realist to know that people have to, you know, pretend that they're doing good and this and that and the other. That's the adversarial politics. But it comes back to my answer to the question before. I'd like us to be talking about how we're actually going to fix these things. My diagnosis, coming from the health point of view, is things are going badly wrong. For our children, for people of working age, not so good for older people. Things are going badly wrong. And what I'd like to introduce to adversarial politics, as it were, is a discussion of the real issues and take out some of the irrelevant stuff about I'm going to be more have more fiscal rectitude than you are and this, that, and the other. I mean, I don't do it very often, but I happened to be in the bathroom at the 8:10 slot this morning on the Today programme. And I hear Nick Robinson attacking Rachel Reeves. And I thought, how long is this going to go on for? He says, well, look, you're not going to have any money. What are you going to do the day after the election? And she says, we're going to grow the economy. And he says, you're not going to have any money. What are you going to do the day after the election? She said, grow the economy. He said, you're not going to have any money. What are you going to do? I thought, how long can they keep this up for? And, you know, does this count for some sort of meaningful interaction? Good heavens. Now, we know why she's saying it, you know, because they figure they won't get elected if they promise anything. And, you know, I'm not a political consultant. I can't tell them what to do to win the election. So that's not me. I can say, and I've said it this evening, what I'd like to see after the election. And whether they'll do it or not, I don't know. But that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see real discussion, grown-up discussion about how we improve society for everybody, create social inclusion, create this to be a better place to live for everybody. That's what I'd like to see.
Right. I think that's a good note on which to end. So I will say thank you to all those who asked questions. Apologies to those that I didn't get to. Michael may be around for a little bit, so you may be able to bug him briefly. There is a book on sale at the top, local bookseller. I'm not on commission, by the way. So thank you to Michael for coming. Fascinating, insightful.
And a big thank you as well to our chair, Mr. Greg Fell.
Thanks to Sheffield Hallam for hosting us, and thank you to Joe and team who were dotted around for organising us. And the last word to Joe.
Thank you very much for coming this evening. It's been lovely to see many people here. The book signing will be happening imminently, although we are limited on time, so we will keep that quite short. This has been the Festival of Debate. Thank you very much. Cheers.